Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Bob the Booker, and today, in something that's probably going to surprise absolutely nobody who's seen any more than about one or two of my videos, I'm going to be talking about a Booker Prize shortlist. What? Curls the breeze, what? Today I want to look at 2015. These ones at the moment are a little bit more in a slightly randomized order, but as I mentioned a little bit in my kind of reading goals for this year, I will start doing a bit of a countdown towards the 2021 Booker Prize by going through every year ending in a 1 or a 6 up until we get to 2021, which is very exciting and a lot sooner coming than I think it is. But today I wanted to look a little bit at 2015, a year that was in some ways dominated by books that were quite violent in some ways and quite brutal, but I think there are some absolute gems within the list as well. So first up, let's go with the winner from 2015. It was Marlon James with A Brief History of 7 Killings. Now this was the first winner from Jamaica and is a story that is largely set in Jamaica with a few sort of bits in the US as well. And it concerns this kind of world around Bob Marley, the famous singer, and kind of a few kind of attempted murders and a few other attempted killings and attacks. And so you can tell right off the bat that not only with the title and what I just said, it is quite a brutal novel. Over about 650 or so pages, there are so many characters whose lives interweave, and you get these really heartbreaking and gritty and brutal descriptions of violence and attacks. But there are also some really beautiful, tender moments tucked in amongst them. For example, there are a couple of characters who are sort of trying to create their new identities, really trying to branch out and find who they are in a world that perhaps doesn't necessarily always seem to want them, or at least actively doesn't seem to show that it wants them. For example, a character who's sort of grappling with his sexuality. And there's a really beautiful depiction there of a gay Jamaican man trying to reconcile his identity whilst being, you know, around people who are quite openly homophobic and quite openly have, you know, quite strong opinions about his identity and who he is and whatever. So you've got this really strange thing where he's almost having to amp up how kind of macho and strong and whatever else he is to kind of almost hide and deflect away from that, which I just thought was really beautifully and powerfully done. It's not an easy read, and I will say sort of off the bat that, you know, I didn't necessarily always gel with parts of this novel. However, there's so much about this book that I respect and really think was done well. It's just that for me, I think, you know, sometimes with books where you maybe early on you don't quite connect with something the way that you would want to, and sort of as a result, a few kind of 100 pages down the line, you're like, this is good, I recognize this is good, I'm just not fully in it, and I wish I was. However, this is a novel I do want to go back and reread because I've heard so many people absolutely rave about it. It obviously also won the Booker Prize. And, you know, as much as I don't always agree with winners of the Booker Prize, generally, you know, a panel of sort of 5 people have chosen this book as well, so there is a lot more merit perhaps in it than I've necessarily seen. I didn't necessarily always connect with it, but I did think it was a really beautiful, beautifully done and really powerfully done in many other ways. But yes, in many ways very, very indicative of the 2015 list, which has so many quite violent and brutal books in it, and then some that kind of almost seem to completely go against that entirely. Next up, alphabetically, we have Tom McCarthy with Satin Island. And this is such a different book to so many others on the list. It is about 200 pages long. It's very experimental in some ways. And a large part of it is concerned with this one character who is trying to unpick these sort of various codes and understand sort of a little bit more about the world around him and about some sort of things he's seen and heard. And so Satin Island, this isn't that much of a spoiler, I don't think. Satin Island is him kind of having almost feeling like he's maybe misheard Staten Island in New York. And so a large part of it goes around there. Now, this book is incredibly polarizing, I think. And it's always quite exciting, you know, whether you like books like this or not, I think it's always quite exciting to see their inclusion on lists, such as, you know, the Booker Prize shortlist. We saw the same with Jenny Offal's Weather in the 2020 Women's Prize shortlist. I think it's really exciting when you get very experimental and different and kind of weird work kind of in the mix as well. I think that's, you know, that adds to the nice variety of it. This is his second time having being nominated for the Booker Prize. 2010 as well, he was also nominated for his novel C. And I find this book quite interesting. Again, I'm not fully sure how much I was connected to it, and I don't, in some ways connecting to it is maybe not the point. You know, it's a lot more meandering, and it's a lot more about his thoughts and him kind of going through. It's in some ways almost no mistake, you know, no surprise that Tom McCarthy himself has a sort of background in science as well, and that kind of comes through quite a lot. There's something quite forensic and almost essay-like about the book. Zadie Smith had this as one of her absolute top books of the year and of almost of all time. She absolutely raved about this, but at the same time, it's one of those books that so many other people were just completely baffled by and put off by. Not gonna lie, didn't necessarily love it, but I do think there's something quite interesting about it. I think it's worth it. I mean, it's a short book as well, so I think it's worth having that little delve into to kind of get something a bit more experimental and a bit more thought-provoking. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's the kind of thing that if I read it, you know, the second time I read it, I'll absolutely love it. Once you kind of got that first bit out of the way of kind of the shock of how it works and, you know, the kind of difference of it. But, you know, there we go. So Tom McCarthy and Satin Island is there on the list and makes this, again, such a strange and mysterious and bizarre list. But no, it's good to see books like that included. Next up, we see Chigozie Obioma with The Fisherman. Now, this novel I absolutely adored. So I do have a massive soft spot for books that are around kind of myths and folklore and fairy tales, particularly when that is then contrasted with the brutality of the kind of life outside of those folklore stories. And The Fisherman for me does this incredibly well. So you've got these young boys who are kind of mystified by this one person in their village, who is this man who seemingly has something kind of magical and ethereal about him. It seems almost like he can't die. It seems like he's both the kind of foretelling of anything coming, so he seems to be able to predict the future in some ways, but also of kind of providing curses and, you know, destroying lives, but also, you know, because of his predictions, also being able to almost save lives and protect people. It's very rich and complicated. And these young boys see such acts of violence around them. And they then kind of balance that off against, you know, trying to live their kind of innocent childhood lives, but also dealing with the fact that they've seen death, they've seen decay. Like, there are some really graphic, horrible scenes. But then through all of this, these young boys still fear and respect this kind of person in their village, and they really look out for it. However, one thing that we learn early on is that a prophecy from this man essentially says that these brothers will turn on each other in some way. Now, what makes that more complicated is most of the boys don't necessarily believe him. They kind of think this is, you know, just sort of what he says. You know, some of his things come true, some of them don't seem to. But one of the brothers takes it absolutely to heart, because he is the one who basically learns that his brothers will betray him, and he cannot deal with this at all. And so from that very moment, he turns incredibly cold and distances himself from his other brothers. Now, in doing so, that essentially sets in motion all of the destruction and decay that comes, because he, in spending time further and further away from them, creates animosity. He creates kind of an enemy, and, you know, creates tensions within the family and all of those kinds of things, and that sets the wheels in motion. And what I really love about this book is how at times we are sort of meant to believe actually these prophecies are entirely true and we should definitely believe them. Sometimes we believe that humans' actions make these things happen, but only if they've had sort of someone lighting the match in the first place and kind of setting everything off in motion. And it's just sort of so layered and deep and brilliant. as I mentioned, really love folklore kind of stories. This feels particularly interesting as well for me at the moment because I'm rereading The Famished Road by Ben Okri. And for me, there are so many of those same brilliant ideas and beliefs coming in of these ancient folklore tales and beliefs about the role of spirits and the roles of ancestors, all kind of interwoven with this idea of a modern developing country in Nigeria, you know, that the sort of a modern forward thinking and whatever that means. Nigeria is kind of really at that interesting crossroads where it's balancing a lot of the kind of recent technological developments. It's, you know, a lot of Western influence and colonialism, and it's balancing that with these really rich and detailed myths and folklore tales that so many people feel so strongly about. They're so rooted in parts of the culture. And for me, that's what makes Fisherman so brilliant. The writing for me is outstanding. I just think this is brilliant. He was nominated again, Obioma was nominated again in 2019 for his book, The Orchestra of Minorities, which has a lot of that kind of same feeling of kind of myths and fairy tales woven in. And I think that's what makes this so exciting, is, you know, not just receiving a story as kind of in a way that the Western canon is often presented, of, you know, a very standard way of presenting stories, but actually hearing stories from so many different perspectives, almost hearing stories through the perspectives of spirits and things like that. And for me, that's really brilliantly done in this book. Again, it's actually fairly short. It's only about sort of 250, 300 pages, but so much seems to happen. And there is this lurching sense of dread all the way through, because essentially we know these prophecies, we know what we've been told is going to be coming, and yet we almost feel that the characters can't do anything to stop it, and they're trapped in these prophecies in some way. I think this is really well done. For me, this is maybe one of the books I would have had as the winner personally. Just, you know, as I said, I didn't necessarily get along with A Brief History of Seven Killings in quite the way that I did with The Fisherman. And so for me, I'd maybe have opted for this book, but, you know, again, there's so many strong things to get from this list, and I'm really glad that this book The Fisherman, was introduced to me as a result of this prize. Next up, we have Sunjeev Sahota's A Year of the Runaways, which I think is really well done. It follows the British migrant experience, particularly for characters from South Asia. So we've got these characters who are kind of coming in to UK life from India, and there are some sort of other characters sort of in the background as well from Pakistan, and their experiences of arriving in the UK, trying to kind of find work, and just being caught in all of these interesting circumstances. So these characters are all kind of living together and kind of supporting each other, you know, buying bits of food, pooling their money together, and they're all just trying to survive. And for many of them, they have this really different and kind of dual conflict going on, where families back home are perhaps really proud of them for having moved to the UK, and there's this kind of expectation that they're going to suddenly become incredibly rich and send all this money home, and they're going to be able to solve all of these problems. And, you know, these families are so proud because they paid for them to do their education in India, or to kind of be somebody or do something, and they come to the UK and they're doing basically menial tasks for a pittance, barely breaking even. Any money that they do have left over, they're trying to scrape together for money, for food, or to send bits of it home. And families back home are getting increasingly desperate for money, or for any news that could kind of sell them to kind of their relatives and whatever as being really successful and whatever. And so you've got these characters sort of darting all around parts of the UK, looking for work. So, you know, there are some quite funny scenes where characters are suddenly kind of saying like, oh, you know, how far is it to Newcastle? And they're in London, and they're like, oh, that's, you know, I'm sure that's just sort of, you know, 20 minutes or something. And these characters, you know, because they are in an entirely new country, and they're trying to work out you know, who they are and what they can do, but ultimately feeling more and more pushed down by the system. I think this is an incredibly timely novel, given recent UK history of kind of tightening rules around migration, and tightening of support that was available. So, you know, a couple of years ago, for example, a lot of English language programs for incoming migrants were removed, and that also, you know, has an impact. And so this book is very, very timely in that sense, but also in terms of bringing out those discussions. You know, India as a former colonial sort of part of Britain's empire is, you know, you've got people moving from India thinking of the UK as this kind of promised land where they're going to become rich and bring home success and money to their families, and they're realizing increasingly that they are just treated like second class or third class citizens once they arrive. And that's really interesting. So I think this novel handles that really well. There's a lot of warmth and humanity and joy and humor in the depictions of these characters, but ultimately we know that they are really crushed by this system around them. It's really quite heartbreaking in moments, and you more and more kind of just realize as this is going on. And I think actually this is partly what I think is brilliant about it, is because it's written from the perspectives of these characters, we are seeing the UK through their eyes. And for me, you know, as someone who's British, as someone who's also white, it's quite uncomfortable, and rightly so. You know, it's really uncomfortable to see kind of characters really trying to make a life for themselves in the UK, to make money, to send back to India, to, you know, do various things, and just being shot down at every moment and being kind of treated so badly. And I think it's again a really important and really timely book, given that, you know, the world is in such a state of flux, and particularly with, you know, environmental concerns in coming years, we are as a world going to have to really address how we think of migration. You know, at the moment a lot of migration is really focused around this idea of, you know, keep those people out, but actually, you know, this becomes a lot more complicated when you consider the UK, for example, and its colonial past, or when you consider how actually treating migrants better would, you know, would really solve some of the problems for people when they arrive. But there's this really punitive and harsh approach to people. So I think this is a really important and really great novel. For me, I found it a tiny bit long in parts, but again, I think that was maybe me being lazy, because it does so much and it covers so much ground, and I think it's a really interesting book, and I really do encourage you to go and check it out. The 2015 list was actually quite a long list in terms of page numbers, but I think the books on it are really well worth reading. Next up, we have a book that is very different from that, and that is Anne Tyler's A Spool of Blue Thread. From the two books I've read so far of Anne Tyler, and from what I've heard, a lot of her work is kind of focused around this idea of family units and change, like generational change, and kind of characters trying to work out the kind of intricacies of relationships. So in this book, we have a set of siblings, and one of them starts really sort of pulling away from the rest of the family, and the rest of the characters are sort of trying to address this whilst also other things are falling apart. So things are changing, you know, the parents are getting older and want to kind of make sure that things are passed along, but all of these siblings are convinced that the other ones are being treated a bit more, are being treated better, or that they are personally being treated unfairly. And so everyone's wandering around as the kind of the kid kind of thinking that nobody loves them, and that they've been ignored and what have you. But a large part of it focuses around this one character, and he finds a lot of discomfort in that family, and basically tries to sort of break away, and every character sort of in their own way tries to interact with him and bring him back into the fold. Some characters don't want that, some others do, and it all starts to kind of be felt that they should all be coming together to address some of these things, particularly when it then comes to, you know, there are children around, there's a house, and they want to decide about the future of this house. Do they sell it? Do they whatever? It also starts with a really interesting moment where this son who feels like he's being ignored, phones his parents and basically says, "Oh yeah, I'm gay," just to see what their reaction is. And we sort of later kind of get the feeling that it was mostly to kind of gauge the reaction. He almost wants to set up circumstances in which the other characters will kick him out, because in that way it will justify his own sort of thoughts that nobody wants him and that he's being pushed out. So it's really dense and difficult in that sense. But actually what's really brilliant about it is Anne Tyler writes with this really warm and generous prose that feels very loving and very light touch at times, while saying quite a lot. So I from the two Anne Tyler books I've read so far, I think the thing that sometimes I find both really intriguing about them and sometimes a bit off-putting is that lightness of touch, because sometimes part of me wants her to really wrangle with some of these things a bit more, or get a bit dirty and get a bit ugly, but actually there's something to be said about keeping that even tone of gentleness and softness throughout, because those sort of small moments where the mask slips, where characters do something a bit out of character or a bit more brutal, those really stick out because of that tone all the way through the book. So I think it's really, again, well done. It's interesting. I think there's a lot of buzz around Anne Tyler. She's an author whose name I've known for a while, but never have, until this year, I hadn't read any of her books. And she's an interesting character, I think, in the sense that there's so much love and warmth that comes out in her characters, and there's a real sense that we should always be forgiving others, that we should be loving people, bringing them closer, inviting them to our table. And in fact, there's a character in The Spool of Blue Thread who this one character, who's occasionally seen as a bit of a bleeding heart, invites this woman in to kind of come and share food with them. And it's just really awkward because all of these family members have had this massive argument and falling out in various ways, but they have to behave because there's this other woman there. But this other woman is so awkward and strange, and doesn't get the family dynamic and is very to the point. So she's always sort of saying like, oh, but why wouldn't you do this? Or like, yes, you told me to come at 10 o'clock, so I'm here, it's 10 o'clock. It's very, very like on the point. So yeah, really interesting, fun family drama. This and Satin Island, I think, are such marked differences to the rest of this list, which can be quite brutal. But I think that makes this list even more fun. And finally, perhaps one of the more polarizing and difficult books on this list is Hanya Yanagihara's A Little Life. So this book is all about mostly around these four friends who live in New York, have known each other for a long time, since they're at university. And they all sort of in various ways belong to the LGBTQ community. I think they're all actually, I believe they all identify really as gay men throughout it. But it's a very queer focused novel in that sense that, you've got a lot of characters who they interact with who are in the LGBTQ community. And it deals with a lot of issues, it's fair to say. This book is about 750 pages long. It goes into so many parts about their lives. I love also the irony of a title called, the title A Little Life, and then 700 pages. But it focuses a lot around this one character particularly, and the other characters sort of being in a bit of a sort of constellation around him. And he gets very, very sick, and very unwell, and it deals a lot with his mental health. It deals a lot with issues around self-harm, around disability. It's a complicated book, to say the least. There are moments of domestic violence, of abuse, quite a lot of abuse actually, and that is part of the reason that some people have kind of branded this sort of being kind of tragedy porn in some ways. That the book is so mired in so much violence and anger and bitterness and difficulty that some of the characters can't seem to see beyond it. For me, this is what makes the book actually so brilliant, is I don't think I've been as affected by a book in quite a long time, especially in this way. There was a moment where I was reading and I had to just sort of stop and just stare at a wall for a good few minutes, because it was so brutal and visceral and unsparing. And for me, that I needed a break at that moment. It was too much. And that, again, is part of the reason why some people love it, because it really makes you feel some things, and why some people hate it, because in some people's mind, it's a bit more exploitative. It's maybe using the kind of tragedy around these characters' lives in a way to really hammer home some points. But then isn't that what a lot of writers do in various other ways? You know, there's a lot to be said either way on that. Some people also pointed to the fact that, you know, it's a woman writing about a lot of gay men. But for me, I think it's quite well rendered in terms of following some of those parts. What for me avoids it being tragedy porn or kind of exploitative is that it does explore characters' feelings around these things. And although it does seem like a lot is being layered on these characters' lives, and a lot of heartbreak and difficulty, a lot of the book seems to be about how you address those. In an author, Yanigahara spoke about how she wanted a character who was unwell but would never get better. And because it's really interesting, because so many narratives obviously have that whole idea of, I don't know, a disabled character or a sick character, and by the end of the book there's some way in which they're well. And she was really interested apparently in this idea that the characters don't get well at all, that they just can continue to either stay at the same level of sickness or get worse. And that does happen with a number of the characters. There are some really brutal and gripping and terrifying and wonderful and so many other kind of adjectives scenes in this book. For me, it's a book that I think is going to stick with me for a very long time. I feel for many people it will stick with them for a very long time, for better or for worse. There are some scenes that I would almost prefer to forget just because of how horrifying and tragic they were. But at the same time, for me, that can make really powerful literature, is being able to grapple these things that seem so big and scary and you can't put words to it. So I think this is a really well done book. Many people thought this would be the first American winner, because this was only the second year that US authors were eligible for the prize. And this book was one of the favorites. Ultimately, obviously, it went to Marlon James with A Brief History of Seven Killings. But this book, in many people's eyes, was the kind of second or third place book. And definitely was a book that gained a lot more of a following ever since. I really enjoyed it, as you can probably tell. And I mean, again, enjoy is not really the word for this book, but there is a lot there. It's so beautiful in parts against that backdrop of so much violence and cruelty. But I think it's always handled fairly well. It doesn't feel like, and here is some abuse. It feels like, actually, here are some characters who are unwell or whose issues are unaddressed in some ways, and this is kind of creating some of these environments for these people. It's not an easy read, but I think is still worth it. And so ultimately that brings us to the end of this shortlist. For me, as you probably can tell, The Fisherman by Chigozie Obioma and A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara are my top two from this list. If I maybe had to pick a third place, I would maybe say either Brief History of Seven Killings or The Year of the Runaways. But either way, I think this is such an interesting list. And again, books that I probably would never have really come round to had I not kind of been reading this book of shortlist. I think it's also an interesting one because, you know, you've got two books that have kind of quite substantial bits around queer characters, which incidentally were the kind of top two books. You know, A Little Life and Brief History of Seven Killings. You've got these sort of tales around the migrant experience in The Year of the Runaways. You've got these sort of family dramas in A Spool of Blue Thread. You've got the very experimental Satin Island, and you've got the other book that I have mysteriously forgotten, which is The Fisherman by Obioma, which concerns these, you know, beautiful, rich folk tales and kind of spiritual kind of ideas. And so again, a really interesting, powerful list. I also think it's probably quite a good thing that we were maybe made to wait for the US winner another year. I think there were so many discussions early on about how having US authors in the for eligible for the Booker Prize would completely ruin all sense of fairness, and it would really upset the balance of it all. But I think we got some really interesting authors out of this. We wouldn't have had A Little Life on the shortlist had it not been for that, and neither would we have had Anne Tyler. So it's really interesting, and I'm excited to kind of read a bit more about it. But I would also love to know your feelings about it. Were there any books on this list that you absolutely adored? Please do tell me why I'm wrong about not completely loving A Brief History of Seven Killings. I'm fairly sure that if I reread it, I would actually really enjoy it. Also, I'd really love to know some of your thoughts around A Little Life. I know that's probably one of the most controversial on the list, but if nothing else, I really hope you enjoy your reading. I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions, and please do take care and enjoy your reading. And I hope your weather will be as nice as this surprisingly sunny day in January. So please do take care and look after yourselves. Bye-bye.